You are listening to Rootbound, a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside.
Rootbound gets sponsorship from the paper mulberry. It's not actually a mulberry, but you can actually make paper from it.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for listening to this episode of Rootbound. I am the host of the show, and my name is Steve. Rootbound is the podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside, and each week I invite a guest who joins me on the show to share with us all about a plant that means something to them, and then I share with the guest about a plant that means something to me. And through this process, we can all learn more about plants and learn more about each other. It is the philosophy of Rootbound that everybody has at least one plant that is meaningful to them, because plants are so integral to our lives as humans on this planet. Now, our guest today, we've met before, back on the pawpaw episode. I interviewed my friend Tara about pawpaws, but if you listen to that episode, kind of interspersed through the interview, it's me and my friend Sebi running around the forest trying to find pawpaws. Well, Sebi's back here now to talk about a different plant in the main interview segment here, and I'm really excited to talk to him about this plant. And it's a really fascinating and a deep look at a particular plant, so let's just jump right into it. Hey, Sebi, how's it going?
Hey, Steve. Great to be here.
Really great to have you here. Do you have a plant to share with us today?
Yeah. Today I'd like to talk to you about the Eastern Red Cedar.
Awesome. I know this plant. I have one out. Actually, used to be one in the front of my house, but my neighbor cut it down. I was a little bit bummed about that, actually. And I have one in the back of my house, but I don't know a ton about it. And I think I know some things that you're going to share. But yeah, really excited to learn about this plant from you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first thing to know about the Eastern Red Cedar is it's not a cedar.
That I did know that one. Yeah. I've got a little bit of a follow-up on that, by the way, on my plant, but we'll save that for when I tell you about my plant. But it's similarly not a cedar.
Nice. Yeah. Well, I think it's actually even cooler than a cedar. I think there's a lot going on with this plant, a lot more than meets the eye. Something that makes this plant very special is how common it is. So when you said you had one in your backyard, it's like, of course you did. Everybody does.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this is one of the most sort of ubiquitous trees in the eastern U.S. And there's a reason for that, and we'll get into it as the podcast goes on. But the eastern red cedar is actually a juniper. Juniperus virginiana, and it's a plant that has a lot of uses, actually, both practical uses and, in the case of my tribe, spiritual uses, and many other tribes around the region where it grows. It's interesting how the plants that are sacred or considered sacred are usually so practical at the same time, which kind of is a distinctly indigenous way of looking at sacredness, where instead of the sacred things being sort of in a glass box or, you know, something that you put away and you kind of venerate and put on a pedestal, no, the sacred things are the practical things that we use and make our lives better. And in this very special, almost ephemeral, but also, material way.
Well, and you also mentioned how common they are, and this idea of abundance is really interesting too, because I think a lot of things, treated as sacred in maybe like Judeo-Christian culture are often maybe more rare, right? You think of these things that are like uncommon, but you just mentioned how common it is, and that's, I think, pretty interesting as well.
Yeah. Well, a big reason that they're so common is a lot due to the impacts of humans on the environment in the past 500 years. Now, Eastern red cedars, something that makes them so cool to me is how tough they are. They can adapt to a ton of different kinds of climates, from clayey to alkaline to acidic soils. I mean, I've seen these suckers just on rocks, just straight up eating rocks. Like, they are amazing. It's really amazing how many different types of environments they can grow in. if you look at their sort of distribution range, I mean, we're talking like from Texas, Oklahoma to Maine to Florida. I mean,
Wow.
there's so many different
Yeah.
climates that they grow in. They're so hardy that but the thing that a lot of their habitats have in common is actually that they thrive in disturbed ground. So, when you
Mm.
have something that's very disruptive to the environment, like building a road or building a house or clearing a field for agriculture, it's the red cedars that are going to thrive in those environments
Ah.
because they're a pioneer species. So if you look at sort of the succession, after a big disturbance or a fire or clear cutting, it's the red cedars that are going to pop up first.
Very interesting. That's really cool because, like, a lot of times on this podcast, when we've talked about the plants that show up in disturbances, they're often non-native or invasive species. So it's kind of cool to hear about the local species that kind of fill that niche as well. Because yeah, it's so often we're talking about the invasives that do that.
Well, yeah, I mean, another example, I guess, would be like mullein, right? Is something that's
Yeah,
such a cool plant, so useful, so great, but yeah, thrives in these disturbed um, habitats.
yeah. The other native one that we've talked about that does that too, and I think I've seen red cedar and this plant together, which is black locust. Also, is really a one to pop up a lot when there's been a disturbance. So super interesting. I think we've covered this a little bit. I want to go back a little bit and just make sure we cover this clear because it's the theme of the show. Why is red cedar meaningful to you personally?
Red cedar is something that it's one of the first smells I can remember. As soon as I see it or smell it, it takes me back immediately to my uncle's farm in southern Maryland, where we would do a lot of our ceremonies. And throughout the ceremonies, before, during, and after, we would burn the leaves of the red cedar tree, and that just beautiful, fragrant smell just permeated the entire property. From the road, you could smell it, and even after you left, your clothes and your hair would smell like, you know, red cedar. It's that smell is so distinctive. It's so unique. It's so penetrating that, it's, even to someone who grew up out in a different cultural context, I think you would understand almost immediately why we are so drawn to it. In Native American cultures, and across the Americas, smudging, the practice of sort of enveloping yourself and cleaning yourself and blessing yourself with a fragrant smoke is a widespread practice. The most popular now is smudging with white sage, um,
Hmm.
and of course, trade networks existed on this continent for centuries and millennia. So, we've had access to sage for a very long
Hmm.
time, but it doesn't grow here. It's from California, the white sage that's widely sort of at this point commercialized and sold through sort of new age and hippie movements.
We actually had a episode about white sage. We had an indigenous woman from Colorado talking about it, and very a very interesting and pretty like complex and often fraught topic with the trade and how it's like been commercialized, and it's a tricky thing. So the takeaway from that for me was that in the for most people it's probably best to just not buy that stuff because it's really hard to like figure out whether you're like contributing to poaching essentially with the white sage.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and now you have something that you can use that is so abundant and so native to where we live that it's literally called Juniperus virginiana. So if
Hmm.
you are looking for a substitute, look no further, because this is something that is, not in the even the most remote way endangered or threatened, which white sage is. Um,
Hmm.
and another great substitute for white sage, which is being over harvested for commercial reasons, is rosemary. If you dry
Ah.
rosemary, or you bundle it up and you burn it, the average person would actually not even remotely be able to distinguish between dried rosemary burning and white sage burning. So there's other stuff you can use, and you don't have to contribute to the exploitation of a very vulnerable species.
Great point. Great point. Okay, super fascinating. Let's maybe get back to some other fun facts and dazzling details about the eastern red cedar.
Yeah, yeah. Well, back to the spiritual sort of significance of it. The smudging of red cedar is used throughout ceremonies as a way to sort of build up your spiritual power and preparedness for entering a ceremony in a more sort of purified and grounded way. Um, the fresh leaves are often used, even though they work just fine dried. The way that most tribes that use red cedar in ceremonies is basically you fill up a coffee can, like an aluminum can, with coals from a fire, and the either the fresh or the dried leaves are dropped on those coals, and the smoke just billows out.
That you just totally triggered something in my mind with that because so like I said, I have this red cedar in my backyard, and a couple years ago there was a heavy snow and one of the branches broke off into my yard,
Mm-hmm.
and I didn't want to I'm like total like hippie gardener. I really like hate removing like stuff from my yard. Like if there's biomass in my yard, I want to keep it there. So I like went through this whole process of chipping it into small pieces. But I was for years actually I've been using those wood chips as the fuel for my a smoker for my honeybees.
Oh,
So I've been
nice.
using eastern red cedar, and this now the smell that you're talking about is like actually made me think about that because it's the smell that I use to smoke my bees. Which unfortunately my bees didn't make it this year, and because I just had a kid, I'm going to be taking a few year break from beekeeping because it's pretty pretty hard to do both, or actually a podcast beekeeper and that. But yeah, the eastern red cedar smoke, I've been using it for the smoking for my honeybees.
How would you describe the smell?
I'm really bad at that, which is sucks for being a guy who hosts a podcast about plants. I mean, it's kind of like musky a bit, kind of sharp. I feel like it's got some high notes, but I don't know if that helps. But yeah, it's good, and maybe it's different from the leaves, which I don't think I've ever smelt the needles or the leaves burning. I've only smelled the chipped wood.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's hard to describe. Like describing
Mm.
smells is so difficult, but it really is just so distinctive. Both the wood and the leaves, they do smell a little bit different, but yeah, they have that just amazing aromatic character.
It, it is similar, and I think why maybe you're going to get to this. Why the colonists who came here called it cedar because it does smell like the like cedar from Europe, or it's adjacent to the like cedar. So like when you have like a cedar chest in your house, or actually a lot of times that I guess is red cedar now, but that original cedar smell, it's adjacent to that. I think.
Yeah, well, actually, you are scientifically right because they do have the same terpenes. Terpenes
Ah.
are volatile essential oils that plants produce, usually for some kind. They're called secondary metabolites. So it's something the plant produces for a reason other than its ability to photosynthesize and reproduce. A lot of times,
Mm.
plants create these terpenes or aromatic compounds as part of their immune system, so a defense against insects or fungi. And some of the terpenes that are contained by cedar are what protects the plant while it's living, and also make it so useful when it's dead. One of them being
Hmm.
cedrol, which is sort of antifungal and antiseptic characteristics. In fact, in indigenous agriculture practices, cedar boughs and cedar chips were used as a mulch to repel insects from food crop plants, and
Oh, I did
also
that by accident a couple years ago too. I took a bunch because that same branch I had a bunch of the boughs, and I was like, "What am I going to do with these?" I put them all around my peach tree, and actually, I think it was really useful for the peach.
it is. I mean, it's a very ancient practice of using
Wow.
cedar as an insect repellent. And in fact, if you use pieces of the heartwood in your dresser or in your closet, it'll repel moths in lieu of
Mm-hmm.
mothballs. Again, it has that insect repellent quality. And if you use the trunks of cedar, like wood, whether planks or just the whole trunks, if you set them as posts in the ground for building structures, house, deck, gazebo, whatever, even sitting in the ground, even in moist, conditions, it won't rot. It's an incredibly rot
Mm.
resistant wood. It's light, it's aromatic, it's got a beautiful color, so it's prized for building materials, fence posts in particular. It's so abundant, it's so resistant. It's really just an incredibly useful wood. In native communities, a lot of us are use feathers as part of our spiritual practice. Either we find them, or we're gifted them for accomplishing a particular good deed or something like that. And we store our feathers in red cedar boxes, because it keeps the feathers clean of feather mites, which are microscopic mites that live on birds. And when the feathers are removed from the birds, the mites, over the course of months and even years, will just slowly nibble feathers
Oh,
down. But if you put it in a cedar box or a cedar chest, they won't. So um,
wow.
cedar is amazing. Another thing about cedar, I guess, for people who haven't encountered it as intimately to know, maybe a basic description. Um,
Oh, yeah. Good, good call.
yeah. So cedar is an evergreen tree. Um, its bark is somewhat flaky, and stringy, and its sapwood is a white or off white color, and its heartwood is a beautiful red, ranging sometimes to a deep maroon.
Mm-hmm.
The
I was shocked at that when this one broke off in my yard to see the heartwood and how like beautiful red it was. I didn't ever imagine that, and I was really amazed.
Yeah, and the heartwood is really special, to my tribe as well, because it sort of reinforces our connection to the tree, because a red it has a red it has a red center, just like us, just like our blood and our
Mm.
heart, our organs are red. The cedar tree has a red heart too, so there's an affinity between human beings and the cedar tree. um, and then the needles resemble other junipers or cedars, except they're a little bit rounded. They're pretty pokey. And there are male and female trees. Male trees have sort of these uh, brown pollen structures, and the female trees have these beautiful, sort of waxy, dark blue berries, which are technically
Mm.
cones, which contain the seeds of the tree.
We just talked about on an episode a few ago about Juniperus communis, the common juniper, which that's where I was blown away to learn that those berries are not in fact berries, that they're technically cones, which is kind of funny to think about.
Absolutely, yeah. And those berries are eaten by primarily by birds, and dispersed that way. In particular, the cedar waxwing is the bird that's responsible for the majority of the dispersal of cedar trees.
That's so cool. I a few this one cedar tree. I'm just now that we're talking about it has had. I've had a lot of interaction with it now that you mention it. But a few years ago too, a little flock, maybe like 5 or 6 cedar waxwings, flew through and sat on that tree. And I have a really great picture of a cedar waxwing with a little juniper berry, like just totally like being a cedar waxwing eating a cedar berry in its mouth. It was very cool. They're a really cool bird.
They are, yeah. Send me that picture. That's amazing.
I will. I'm gonna make it the show pick. Actually, definitely, it's good. But yeah, I'll send it to you after this.
The the cedar also can get pretty big, depending on the sort of soil, the type of soil it's in. I mean, in poor soils, it can live for a very long time and be very hardy and very rugged and very tough, but sometimes it can be sort of like scrubby or kind of gnarled, especially on heavy point or on points or windbreaks. The cedar trees can get very scraggly, and I've seen some really scraggly red cedar trees in windy spots or on rocky cliffs or overhangs. But in well drained soil, like for example, they're often planted as windbreaks along the edges of agricultural fields. So that's like well drained, fertile
Mm.
soil. Cedar trees can get so tall and so huge. I mean, it's really unbelievable. Some of these trees are like, I don't know, like 60 feet or something like that, which, you know,
Wow.
for a tree that, is relatively, abundant or sort of humble and relatively fast growing. I mean, these trees, they really get huge. They also live for a really long time. I think the oldest recorded cedar tree was found in West Virginia, and it was dated to be 940 years old, which means
Whoa.
almost certainly there are trees and have been trees that are older than that.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. And I guess I was just imagining how big it might have been, but I guess you're just saying it could have not been big because I guess it just depends on where it grows, whether it can, just because it's old doesn't mean it's big and vice versa, I guess, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think actually some of the longest lived trees in North America are junipers. So
Yeah.
it's a very it makes sense, right? That this would be a long lived tree.
Hmm. Very, very interesting. Yeah, very cool. Do we have any other fun facts and dazzling details about the red cedar? Or are we missing anything?
Fun facts and dazzling details. I mean, I don't if you want to grow apple trees, make sure that there are no red cedars nearby. Cedar apple rust is a very common fungal pathogen that can live pretty comfortably on red cedars for a very long time, but will very much negatively impact your apple trees. Mountain laurel is also a very common native plant that is a host for that fungal pathogen. So
Oh,
something to keep mind of.
interesting. Yeah, we talked about that on my episode about June berries because June berries are the same kind of fruit as an apple. They're like the same. They're a pome, which is the
Yeah.
same family, and so there is a different. Maybe I think it's slightly different. It's a cedar quince rust, but it affects the Juneberry. So all the Juneberry bushes in my neighborhood, if you don't get to the Juneberries fast enough, they all like get covered in this like weird orange powder. It makes them look like little coronaviruses that are like shooting out like Cheeto dust. It's very weird. It looks very strange, but it's really interesting because it has this like this two-stage life cycle where the fungus lives part of its life cycle on cedar and part of its life cycle on a quince or a apple or a Juneberry.
Yeah, I've heard pears, especially certain varieties,
Mm.
are more tolerant. So
Mm.
anyway, those are
Interesting.
for you aspiring
Yeah,
fruit growers.
interesting. Yeah, that's fascinating. Anything else? What, we missing anything?
Well, there's a particularly important cedar tree in Maryland, which we call our Tree of Life. And it's located in Piscataway Park, which is a national park along the banks of the Potomac River, directly across the river from Mount Vernon, which was George Washington's estate. That's on the Virginia side. Right on the Maryland side is Piscataway Park, which is the site of the Moyone Burial Grounds, which is a very holy place for our people, where tens of thousands of our ancestors are buried. It was also the location of our original reservation, which was established in the 17th century and disbanded in
Mm.
1720, and the site of our principal village, also called Moyone. The last chief to be buried there was my great grandfather Turkey, and he he planted a red cedar tree there on the burial grounds a few years before his death, and he told his sons, "Bury me here under this tree." He taught us
Mm.
basically that it was custom for chiefs of our tribe to be buried under a red cedar tree, and the reason for that being that the cedar tree would, in in uh, uh, in being planted over that chief would absorb the chief's life force and power and be a living manifestation of the chief after he or she died. And so now that cedar tree is a very sort of important center pole of our spirituality. Every year we tie tobacco ties on the tree in memory of our ancestors and people in our community who have died that year. So that cedar tree not only carries the life force and memory of Chief Turkey, but it also carries, all the ancestors that we every year as part of our Feast of the Dead ceremony, which is sort of like a Day of the Dead in Mesoamerica, a similar vibe. That's part of our practice is to bring our ancestors to that tree, speak their names, honor their memory, and that's all done on a red cedar tree.
And where he's buried at, in Accokeek, Maryland, there's a sacred cedar tree there. And he told us that when he passed on to the spirit world, that he would be able to still help us from that sacred tree.
Very good. Well, thank you so much for sharing about the Eastern red cedar with me. Do you mind if I share about a plant with you?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, so I hinted a little bit earlier that my tree is also not a cedar, but it is called Spanish cedar. It's another tree, and it's also not Spanish. It's got two wrong names. It's one of those plants that has two wrong names. So this tree is called Spanish cedar, and I'll tell you first why it's meaningful to me, and then we'll get into a little bit what it is. So this is a tree. So I work for this nonprofit called the Environmental Investigation Agency. We investigate environmental crime, and a few years ago, I was in Peru making this this film, and I was in Madre de Dios in the south part of Peru, and we're making a film about illegal logging, but I had never really experienced what that really meant before. And then we got to this river, and someone pointed out down on the river there was this like series of rafts that had these blocks of wood on them, and they said, "Oh, that's Spanish cedar," and where it's coming from, there's no way that it is legal.
Right.
And so it really just kind of like connected that to me of like, oh yeah, this is a real problem. This is happening all the time. There's, people stealing wood for selling in, in cities in the United States, in Europe. But let's talk about what the tree is, because it's interesting. Okay, it's called Spanish cedar, but as I said, it's from the jungle. It actually starts in like the lower Mexico and kind of goes down all the way into Peru. It's got a pretty broad range for a tropical tree. It's called Spanish cedar, I think, just because of the Spanish influence in Latin America, and it has a smell. Apparently, I've never smelled it, but it smells similar to all the cedars. So it's I think similar to Eastern red cedar. Some European dudes got there like, this smells like cedar. Okay, we're going to call this cedar.
Yeah.
But it's an entirely different genus. Its Latin name is Cedrella odorata, so they named the whole genus similar to cedar. The cedar from Europe, the most, the true cedar as they call it, is Cedrus. This is Cedrella. But so like they even named its Latin name after cedar, but it is not anyway. It's not an evergreen. It's like a traditional jungle tree with like pretty big leaves, semi-deciduous, because you don't need to be that deciduous in the jungle. It can get very big, and it's very sought after because it has beautiful wood, just like Eastern red cedar. It's also rot resistant, like Eastern red cedar. It is insect repellent. It's got all the same characteristics as the other cedars, but it's a just kind of different kind of tree that's in the jungle. But because of that, it's very in demand. It's a super popular tree, and it's been very popular for commercial purposes since colonialism, since Europeans found it and like we can use this. So it's very at risk to illegality. So yeah, that's the tree I'm going to talk about today.
Awesome. I think it's interesting, like the sort of like no true cedar, like no true Scotsman thing, where it's like, these
Yeah.
plants really have a lot in common, and I know we have to have our botanical distinctions, but to some
Uh-huh.
extent, it's like, well, what? So we're just going to say the old world one is the true one, and everything else is a knockoff? Like it seems kind of like messed up to me.
Sure. It's, on the other hand, though, it's one of those things where actually I was going to ask you this. I don't know if you happen to know any indigenous names for Eastern red cedar.
I actually don't. That's something that I should definitely ask elders and try to figure out. I have some other. I don't know what the structure of your show is, but I just scrolled down. I remember that I have some mind blowing stuff about the Eastern red cedar.
Okay,
After you're done,
let's. Oh yeah, we'll jump back into it because I definitely want to hear those mind blowing stuff. But yeah, I was saying with the name cedar, I think that has happened so often with plants where the Europeans just named plants here after stuff they knew back home, and then it gets stuck with this like European name, and then the real name kind of often gets like wiped out. And there's a lot of times where like I couldn't find very easily a native name for this. It's just called cedro in Spanish.
right?
Um, and I'm sure that you get to the right places and people call this a tree something that is in their language. But yeah, it's not something that bubbles to the top of the internet. So that's something I'm always very interested in is like learning what what was this called by the people who live with it and know it the best.
Right.
So, a few fun facts and dazzling details about the Spanish cedar. Um, it can grow up to 30 meters tall, so that's pretty tall. It's not the tallest tree in the forest, but pretty tall. Um, it is really popular as timber because of that rot resistantness, and a lot of um, wealthy people throughout history wanted to use it as timber. It's also really good for peeling veneer. Not every tree can you like peel really thin layers off of it to like put on top of plywood or other things to like make it look like a one big piece of wood. But Spanish cedar is particularly good at peeling for veneer. Um, this is also interesting. It's also one of the most popular woods for use in humidors to build the humidors for cigars, and I think that's probably related to the same qualities as red cedar, the box, and talking about the feathers. It's rot resistant, antibacterial properties. I think in this case it's also good at like maintaining humidity.
Hmm.
And then it is also still to this day super popular in certain musical instruments, and I guess the most commonplace that it pops up is in the necks for flamenco guitars specifically, which is interesting, which is probably some way it got the Spanish cedar name because it's interesting to think about this like truly Spanish instrument, the flamenco guitar, but it needs this wood from Latin America.
Right.
And then the last little thing which popped out to me about the uses of it, and I didn't know this, but it's super cool. Is apparently it's a really popular tree in the jungle for honey production because I guess it has really abundant flowers and that they produce a really nice nectar. And so there's people who keep bees near cedar in particularly to gather the nectar from it, which I thought was pretty interesting.
That's amazing.
And then just before I get back to your mind-blowing facts, the one thing I wanted to mention, which is I don't think maybe this has come up on the show before, but it's something that in the work that I do at EIA is something we talk about a lot. There's a thing, an international agreement that is called CITES. It is the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species, and most of the countries in the world are party to this agreement called CITES, and it's a way that countries can attempt to control the trade of endangered species. And so the idea is like, if you're a country and you have a certain resource, a plant, an animal, it's really hard to control the trade in that if no other country agrees, right? Like it's really difficult. So this agreement is an attempt to control that a little bit, but it has a few different layers, and so there's three main appendixes to this treaty. Appendix 1 just means everybody agrees that this is completely forbidden from trading. Appendix 2 means that every country in the world needs to agree that there's going to be a system of permits for trading it, so that everyone can keep track of how much is being traded, and that the trading is not hitting some kind of unsustainable level. And then Appendix 3 is kind of the weakest version, where it's like the country where it grows can demand that people respect the permits from their country, but it doesn't control world trade, right? Every other country that's Appendix 3 doesn't have to have it. But that said, is I was surprised to learn that Spanish cedar, which is one of the oldest like commercial hardwoods from Latin America, and it has a major issue with illegal logging for a long time, it only got listed Appendix 2 in 2020. It was Appendix 3 for a very long time, which Appendix 3 is kind of the weakest form of protection. And so I was kind of surprised it took that long for this tree that is like one of the most sought after, one of the most illegally logged trees to get uplisted to Appendix 2. Almost very few things get, if you get Appendix 1, things are like really dire for that species. So I'm glad that it's Appendix 2 now, but it took a long time.
Yeah, and probably a lot of advocacy from people like the folks that you work with.
Yeah, totally. And for some reason, I don't think we were super involved with the Spanish cedar. I think I would have heard about that, but there's a few other species of wood that got uplisted around the same time from the same places. And yeah, so it's not a perfect solution. Definitely, there's lots of situations where just requiring people to make pieces of paper doesn't always do a great job about protecting it. But at least it's better than nothing. So hopefully, there's some hope that this tree can thrive a little bit more and not be as like harvested illegally and can kind of be the tree that it needs to be where it's from.
Right, right.
But yes, what are those mind-blowing facts about the getting back to the other cedar, one of the other cedars?
Mind-blowing historical facts about red cedar is that there's actually a wood henge in Cahokia. Cahokia is an ancient pre-Columbian sort of temple complex on the scale and immensity of the highly developed urbanized civilizations in Mesoamerica. Imagine just like the Mayan temples, but in North America.
Mm-hmm.
That's what Cahokia is.
Yeah, they're in like, where are they? I was just
St. Louis, like outside of St. Louis, Missouri.
Yeah,
technically on the Illinois side, I think. But there in Cahokia, they have the same way there's like a Stonehenge in in Britain.
Mm-hmm.
They have a wood henge, and it's a series of timber circles that was built by the Cahokia people around 1000 AD. And guess what tree the logs were from to make the wood henge was eastern red cedar. Another amazing thing, speaking of the Mississippian cultures, which were an extremely important sort of pre-European civilization in North America. In Louisiana, the tribes there that really, I mean, they were ancient civilizations. They were larger than a lot of the Eastern Woodlands tribes that the Europeans encountered. So the large civilizations there, they were using eastern red cedar posts to demarcate sort of hunting and territorial boundaries. And one of those such posts was found in, drumroll, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Baton Rouge, which refers to the eastern red cedar.
Which means red
post.
Stick, a red post.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
So
that is a mind-blowing fact.
That's what I'm saying. And then, okay, last mind-blowing fact of eastern red cedar is that one of the main sort of constituent secondary metabolites in the leaves, not the wood, but the leaves, is saffrole. I don't know if you have done an episode on sassafras yet. If you haven't, you should.
I have.
Okay.
Yes.
Did you guys talk about saffrole?
Yes, absolutely. I did not know there is saffrole in eastern red cedar.
There is saffrole in eastern red cedar. Saffrole is a very important medicinal compound to a lot of indigenous medicine practices throughout North America. Sassafras tea was used by my tribe to treat diseases related to the blood and liver, as well as during grieving and mourning to help elevate people's spirits, when they were dealing with different tragedies and stuff. And sassafras tea was also a very important drink in the springtime when the saplings could be pulled and their root bark could be harvested to make teas. So I grew up drinking sassafras tea in the spring. It's just like, it's so tasty if you ever get the opportunity to try sassafras tea. But the active ingredient in sassafras is saffrole. which happens to be the precursor to the synthesis of MDMA, also known as ecstasy.
Right.
But just like all plant medicines that have been like horribly corrupted, like coca leaves, for example, they usually start
Hmm.
as this very, very important, very sort of sacred, very ubiquitous herbal medicine, right? And it has this active compound that is in small quantities and used in appropriate dosages and cultural context can really help. And then, of course, you synthesize it and you mess it up and it hurts people. But anyway,
Yeah, because of that, the federal government, like saffron was like I think it's maybe even still
it's
illegal.
still illegal.
Like there's weird, right? And like that's why we can't have real root beer anymore, because original root beer, that was one of the primary components, was like, sassafras. One of the roots in root beer was sassafras root, but those flavors in root beer have been like are synthesized in the lab now, because you're not allowed to like use that in like food products, commercial products.
Right.
Yeah, it's lame. It's lame.
It's super lame, but you can make it yourself. Sassafras is extremely abundant and totally available for foraging in general, eastern woodland regions. And red cedar, the tips of the leaves, the fresh shoots, especially on younger trees, can be brewed into a tea, and that also contains saffron.
Oh,
There have been
cool.
studies that I'm just like, you know how it is, government funded studies that say it may or may not
Mm,
be carcinogenic.
mm,
Considering the history of the war on drugs and the demonization of indigenous
mm,
practices in medicine, I'm very skeptical of those claims. I've never heard of.
mm-hmm.
I've also just people. You don't use these things in excess. You don't use them every day. You don't
Mm-hmm.
ingest hyper concentrated extracts of these things, which is what they do when they test them on rats and labs. So
Yeah,
I would be
yeah.
too worried to tell people like, hey, you can actually use these things. Also, the berries can be used in lieu of other juniper berries, as a
Oh,
seasoning
cool.
spice if you dry them out and crush them or cook them with food. It's a somewhat milder, a little bit less astringent than juniper berries that you would
Hmm.
buy at the store. So
Because Turkey is there, we have a connection there and it can't be broken. And so even Turkey in death is there protecting and making sacred the site of Moyon.
That clip you just heard, and also the clip we heard earlier in the show talking about the eastern red cedar planted in honor of Chief Turkey Tayak, is from a documentary that Sebi sent the link to me after we were talking. And it's a documentary called The Flickering Flame, Life and Legacy of Chief Turkey Tayak. It was produced in 1999, and it is a really fascinating film about the life of the Piscataway chief, Turkey Tayak, Sebi's great-grandfather. I really highly recommend you checking it out and watching it. It really provides a lot of really interesting history about the Piscataway people, and also this area around Washington, D.C., and it's just kind of history that I never learned in school, and I think it's something that more people should understand. Turkey Tayak was involved in the American Indian movement. He was an activist, he was an herbalist, and seemed like a really, really fascinating guy. So definitely check out that documentary. And to end the show, let's hear just one more clip from that film. And the voice you will hear now is of the late Chief Billy Redwing Tayak, the son of Turkey Tayak. And if you'll remember from earlier in the episode, the eastern red cedar where Chief Turkey Tayak is buried is directly across the Potomac River from George Washington's Mount Vernon estate. And I've been there. You can actually see the Mount Vernon mansion across the water.
Turkey today is looking across the river at George Washington's home saying, yes, we're still here. And you're not going to destroy us. All the policies that you put into forth, becoming the president, first president of the United States, and your successors have put in, but you're not going to destroy. So he's there looking across the river, confronting George Washington every minute, every second of every day. And I believe it's a symbol of the Indian resistance in this country today. I'm here to tell the United States government and all these other immigrant governments of North, Central, and South America, and I'm living proof of it, that their policies of genocide failed. And we're on our way back. And that's the legacy that Chief Turkey left us.
My guest on this episode of Rootbound was Sebi Medina Tayak. Sebi is the founder and head grower of Red Cedar Farms, which cultivates regenerative organic cannabis and tobacco in the Washington, D.C. area. He is also an environmental justice activist and member of the Piscataway Indian Nation, a state-recognized tribe in Maryland. If you like Rootbound and you want to help support the show, visit rootboundpodcast.com/support to find all the ways you can help support the show, including just telling a friend. Rootbound is hosted by the Cedar celebrating Steve Ellington. Music by Christian Kriegesgota. Fake ads by David Alani. Rootbound is a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside, but if you can go outside, try to figure out whose land you're on.
Paper mulberry! It can be paper, but it's not a mulberry. Plant names are confusing.